Excellent. Okay, right. So, like Bastian mentioned, I'm going to be talking about using internship programs to build your community, to build your open source community. So I have a couple of basic assumptions at the moment, which is that you already are working open source. If you want to learn more about that, we can discuss that another time. I'll be very happy to do so. And that you are doing some sort of computational work or something that relates to computational work. So that doesn't mean necessarily that you have to be a coder, but maybe you are adjacent to code in some way. So there is a link right at the bottom here. That is the bit.ly OSS interns ISCB. There is a document there, which you can follow along. It has notes that roughly mirror the slides. It has a link to the slides. And I will be asking people to write answers to questions at various points as we're going through this today. So hopefully it won't just be me talking at you, but you'll also get a chance to interact and think and talk back as well. So let's move on to the slides. So hey folks, I'm Yo. So right now my day job is as the Executive Director of Open Life Science. Is the screen a bit glitchy for anyone else? It is. Okay.
Yep.
Let me see if I can fix that. It doesn't like me. I'm really sorry. It's nothing too important. It mostly says, who am I? But hopefully it won't be glitchy on any important slides further down. So yes, I'm Executive Director of Open Life Science, which is a small nonprofit organization, which is designed to help people share their research openly. So we run a 16-week mentoring and training program, and which basically people apply open research concepts to projects that they are working on with the idea that they can then build community. Before that, I came from a background of software engineering. So I've worked as a research funder talking about software engineering. I've worked as a research software engineer at a university. I've worked at academic spinouts and also in industry. And so I've worked in a range of both open and closed source roles, but I'm going to be talking mostly, like I mentioned earlier, about the open source and also more specifically about how it applies to research roles. And over this time, I've had interns. I've been participating in intern programs since about 2017. This will be my 6th year where I've run it as a mentor or organization administrator or both. And I went through and tried to count how many I've had, but I've participated in just enough programs. I'm like 2 there and then 8 there and then, oh, but I forgot about those 2. So I think it's somewhere between 40 and 50 interns that I've managed over the last 5 years. And I'm looking forward to expanding that again this year. So that sort of gives you an idea of who I am and why I'm talking about this stuff in particular. And the first thing I'd like to know is, who are you? So once again, I'm really sorry about the glitchy slides, folks. I'm not quite sure why it's doing that. There are 2 questions there that I would like people to answer if possible. On the left, I'm asking, have you ever been an intern or supervised an intern? And what made it memorable? And then the second question I have is, what brought you to this session today? And are you interested in mentoring an open source intern? So if you visit the OSS Interns ISCB link, which I think Peter recently reposted in the chat as well, there is room to actually show that. And let me see if I can get that up as well. There we go. So if I could just, I'm going to literally just pause for a minute or 2 and ask if folks can just hop over to this document and optionally add your name to the roll call, but also answer those questions. So opening question 1, have you ever been an intern? And opening question 2, what brought you to this session today? And optionally, if you want, over here on the top right, you can choose a font color and or associate it with your name. I always have to be yellow. It's just the way it works. So choose the color that works for you as well. And I'm going to switch back to my slides and mute so you don't have to have everyone watching the typing. Okay, I'm going to wait a little longer just to give everyone a chance to answer, especially question 2 is particularly useful because we're talking about what brought you to the session today. I'd like to make sure that I address the things that particularly interest you. And if you are watching this on YouTube later on, we will try and anonymize the answers and just put the non-personal items online so that you can review it later on and see all the notes as well. Okay, there's a little bit more typing happening. I'm going to unpack one of the terms that I'm using because I may use a few other terms on the way. So I've used the word intern here, and I know that can mean a lot of different things. And also it depends on the program that you are using as to whether or not intern is the term that's used in that particular program. So for example, on my screen right now, you can see Google Summer of Code and Outreachy, which are 2 internship programs. Outreachy uses the term intern. Google Summer of Code does not. However, if I say intern, I'm referring generally to all of these programs. Google Summer and the Code and Google, wow, extra tongue-tied there. Let's try again. Google Summer of Code. Previously, they used the phrase student because it used to be only students who were eligible for Google Summer of Code. Now they use the phrase Google Summer of Code contributor because they've opened the program more widely. So if I say student, contributor, intern, I mean the same thing, which is someone who has been working on your project for a period of a few weeks to a few months, where you know that it's going to be temporary and that you are helping them learn whilst they are helping you by doing work. So I think the typing has stopped. So I'm going to just take a quick look at the notes in the Etherpad. Thanks to everyone who's been sharing. So we have quite a few people who have actually supervised interns in the past and a couple who maybe haven't or have been interns themselves. Okay, that's really useful. And we also have others looking how to bring biologists without formal training up to speed. Yep, that's a really great one. Trying to stay informed, how to get more volunteers involved in these projects and how to make them an asset rather than just a time drain. These are really brilliant questions. If we don't, I'll try and address them as we go, but there will also be question and answer sessions later on. So if people want to ask again and I haven't covered it, please do raise it. I also love the thing about building confidence. It's a really good way. Sometimes doing it hand in hand with someone else who has done it before is a nice way to build confidence. But I'll also talk about my first experience mentoring an intern and what made it easy for me and why I'd recommend following similar suit later on. Okay, back to the slides. I don't trust these slides not to go glitchy again, so I'm not going to put them in full presentation mode. I'm going to look at them in windowed mode right now, and I think it should mostly be readable. If it isn't, please pop in the chat and say, yo, make this bigger, and I will try to do that. So, like I was saying, I'm going to be talking about 2 programs today, Google Summer of Code and Outreachy. There are other open source internship programs. They vary in different ways, but I'm going to speak about the ones that I have experience of because that's easiest, to be honest, and they are some of the biggest ones. So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about the value exchange. Oh, it's still being glitchy. This is a bit annoying. And okay, there we go. It's displaying nicely. Excellent. So internships are about value exchange. That is to say that you do things for the interns and interns do things for you. And it should go both ways. So I would heavily discourage internships where people are unpaid, because usually that means that the person is doing work for free. They're probably already coming from a privileged background if they can afford to do that. And if they're not, it's certainly going to be very exploitative. So all the internships I'm talking about, people get paid for their time to do what they're doing. And on the intern side, apart from getting paid, they also learn about open source community norms, which can be very useful if you've never contributed as a coder or worked in a team. This is a chance over a few weeks to dip your toe and learn how to interact with other people. You also get experience on your GitHub profile, or it doesn't have to be GitHub, of course, it could be somewhere else, but because it's open source, it's something that will follow you along for basically forever, at least until the platform where that profile is shown disappears. And as someone who has worked in industry, I know that most of my industry work is gone. I mean, I don't know if anyone still uses it, if it's disappeared, but it's behind I can't show it to anyone. So it's really valuable especially for someone who's quite young or inexperienced, to get a bit of open source experience on their profile. And you may be able to give them job recommendations if you've worked well with them, even if afterwards you don't talk or they don't join the community, it's still beneficial for them. On the other side, if you are an organization running an internship program or mentoring an intern, it's quite nice to have people who are paid to work on your project. So, for example, I think one of my first interns made an iOS app for the application I was working on at the time. And we didn't have in-house skill to make an app for an iPhone. So this meant that we didn't have to do a full-time hire, or we didn't have to go to expensive consultants, but they were able to bring in this sort of expertise for a short period of time. And I think one of my previous jobs, after we started our internship program, every single hire we had came from our community building efforts. So you can think of it as a sort of try before you buy in some ways. You work with them for a few weeks or a few months, and then when you have job vacancies, send them the link, and if they like working with you, they'll apply. So it's a really nice way of actually building community and getting more people to work on what you've been working on. A couple of caveats around these internship programs is that they must be on open source code. So if you have something that is closed, then you won't be eligible for either of these programs. And you need to have some community. So that doesn't mean you have to have a bustling call every week. It does mean that you have to have a couple of other people around to give the intern advice and to make them not feel like they're alone at the end of a computer. So I think Outreachy requires 2 community members as a very, very minimum. And I would normally recommend when you have a project, especially if you're new to it, that you have at least 2 mentors. That means if at any point the intern is stuck, or a mentor isn't responding, or a mentor is mean, or intentionally or accidentally, that they have someone else to reach out to. Especially important, I think, in pandemic times when someone could literally fall off the face of the earth because they're sick. So, move on to my next slide. Excellent. Now I'll talk about some of the things that are different between Google Summer of Code and Outreachy, and why I reference these 2 programs. So Google Summer of Code, which is also shortened to GSOC, G-S-O-C, is only coding. It's been through a lot of transition over the last few years. So some of the things haven't been tried out necessarily. Like I mentioned earlier, that previously GSOC used to only be for students, but now it is also for anyone who wants to get experience in open source code. Last year, projects were 175 hours long, which is about, I think, 6 weeks of roughly full-time coding. Years before, they'd been 350 hours, which is about 12 weeks of roughly full-time coding. This year, we can choose either, which means that you can figure out what project size suits you, and then you can make multiple project ideas depending on what you need and what the project needs. So there's a nice bit of flex there that's available. This is one of my favorite parts of Google Summer of Code, although this is very much a before times photo. So this here is the chocolate table from the Google Summer of Code Mentor Summit. So Google Summer of Code, at the end of every internship round, when you've had someone who's been coding for you for 175 or 350 hours, they have a summit where all the mentors get together. They talk about the challenges of running an open source project. They talk about literally anything. There's huge notice boards on the wall where people set the agenda when you turn up on the day. And there's a chocolate table. Everyone brings a couple of bars of chocolate. It is always eaten by the end. It is a feat of human greatness that we managed to eat this much chocolate, and it is so joyous. Of course, it hasn't happened the last few years. I'm looking forward to the day when it's safe for it to happen again. But the reason I'm actually going to highlight this, apart from the chocolate, which is delightful, is that it's really nice to be able to network with people who work the same way as you do and learn their tips and their tricks for when they are working on when they're working on open source projects and when they're working with interns and with students. Right, I'm going to talk about outreachy, and let me see if I can make that screen. It's not gonna, is it? About, nope. Okay, right. It doesn't really have that value exchange header. It's just the screen glitching a little bit. So this is a statistic from the 2017 GitHub survey, which said that basically open source software developer is mostly boys, and there is relatively few people who aren't white. And that's something that, quite honestly, is something we should all be wanting to fix. And so, enter Outreachy. There we go. Outreachy is a program that is very similar to Google Summer of Code, what I've described earlier, where people get paid to code, but it expressly invites anyone who faces underrepresentation, systemic bias, or discrimination in the technology industry in their country. So, some of the differences here is that whilst Google Summer of Code is backed by Google, which has a lot of money, Outreachy is backed by an open source organization, which is to say that whilst Google manages to pay interns from Google's budget, whilst you're participating in Outreachy, you actually have to put money up front yourself. That's actually changed a little bit recently, specifically for people who are watching this. So whilst each intern costs, an organization needs to put $7,500 up front for the internship, recently both the Wellcome Trust and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative have started sponsoring open science internship spots. So if you are participating in an open science project and you have an idea of something that people could work on, then you can actually apply for these sponsored spots, which means that you don't have to put money up front. However, I think still if you have it available, then it's very good to offer that as well. And if you can pay for one intern, Outreach is very often able to help you with funds for a second intern if you have someone else who's very good who applies as well. Another difference with Outreachy is that Google Summer of Code, as the name suggests, runs in summer in the Northern Hemisphere. Outreachy runs twice a year. So that means that, for example, students who are in the Southern Hemisphere would struggle to participate in Google Summer of Code because their summer break does not coincide with Northern Hemisphere summer break. So having Outreachy actually be different, have 2 times a year gives a bit more chance for people to participate from around the world. And the other nice thing is that you can participate in any kind of open science projects with Outreachy, so it doesn't have to be code, which Google Summer of Code must be. So for example, you might have a project you think, I could really use a designer to work on this, or maybe I want someone to do a UX study or something like that. It could also be things like documentation or even a small research-related project that could be appropriate for a short-term intern working on this 3 months for 30 hours a week, I think it is. I'm going to try presenting again since it was glitchy anyway. Okay, right. So talking about time commitments. The time commitment really varies during Google Summer of Code and Outreachy, depending on when it is. They're both about the same in terms of the ebb and the flow. So the very, very heaviest time commitment tends to be just before or during the intern application period. And that's because quite often you may have 20 or 30 people, maybe even 50, depending on how popular your organization is, who are saying, hi, I want to help. I want to show you how good I am, so that you can then choose me as your intern. So you need to be prepared to dedicate a bit of time to this, to reviewing their contributions, to answering questions, to writing docs if you get the same question over and over again, so that you don't have to answer the same questions over and over again. So that definitely takes quite a bit of time. I think it's worth only having 1 or 2 projects the first time you do this. to keep the number of interns applying down, because if you had 10 or 12 projects, the actual number of people applying would probably be very overwhelming. And so it's important when you do this to also think of a few tasks that people can work on that don't require you to constantly be coming up with new ideas. So for example, for the OBF, when we had an outreach intern, we asked them to, one of the things they could do was design a logo. And that's something that multiple people can do. And it gives you an idea of the design skills without actually you requiring to think up another task and another task and another task. So try and think that sort of thing through. What can I get people to work on when they start applying and to work with me? Because it's open source, it's quite a normal process that people say, hey, I'm going to do a bit of work, and then you'll choose me based on my work. In outreach, it's required. So you cannot apply for an organization if you haven't made a contribution. In Google Summer of Code, it's not mandatory, but a lot of organizations like it that way, because it gives you an idea of what it's like to work with a given intern. So that's definitely the heaviest part. Once you get to the end of the application period, it suddenly becomes a lot gentler. You now have the difficult work of choosing who you want from amongst your amazing applicants. And I find this really heartbreaking, because usually I've now been working with people for a few weeks, maybe even months, and I really like them all, but there's no way I could actually take them all because I don't have that many spots available to me. So with Outreach, you know how many spots you have because presumably you've got that many upfront funded. With Google Summer of Code, you actually only find out once you have promising students. You say, I would like to have 3 slots or 7 slots, please. And then Google will come back and say, okay, you can have 7 slots. Or sometimes they'll say, actually, you can only have 5. So you have to be flexible and think about what projects are most important to you when you're selecting interns. But at this point, the time commitment is basically just to review the application. So it suddenly becomes a lot gentler than it was when you've got a lot of eager applicants involved. And then the study part comes on. So once interns actually start their work, I would say between 2 and 10 hours per week. 10 hours is usually someone that you've taken on who's very new and needs a lot of hand-holding. But on the other side, the 2 hours per week is if you have an intern who maybe is quite mature, or they've run a project on their own before and they don't need to be guided too much. And quite often, most of them fall somewhere in between in this range. So it might be that they are self-guided, but there's a hell of a bug that you've just really got to work through together. And so you're going to sit on a computer together and just try all sorts of wacky ideas to figure out what's going on. And my advice here, so the very first time I did Google Summer of Code, we said, this is a lot. We don't know what it's going to be like. We're not going to take more than 2 interns. And of course, our team ended up taking 5 because we were very, very greedy. It was okay. We did manage okay. Every single one graduated. Every single one passed their, they actually completed their projects. But I wouldn't recommend taking on a lot at the start because it can be a lot to swallow. But for me, I was quite lucky because my intern, they'd been a vet and they decided that they wanted to change their careers and that they wanted to actually be a software developer. So they'd requalified and they were already in their 30s by the time they did this, which is to say that I had someone who was self-managing as an intern, and that meant that it wasn't a lot of effort for me to have to manage them or worry about them. And actually, they were touring Europe whilst they were doing their internship. I only found this out afterwards, after they'd been accepted. But like I'd speak to them once a week usually, and she'd be like, "Oh yeah, I'm in Spain right now." And then the next week she'd be like, "Yeah, actually, I'm in Portugal." But somehow they delivered fantastically. So that was a nice, easy experience, and I would absolutely recommend for your first one. Pick for someone that you're confident can do the job. Later on, if you're happy and you really enjoy working with interns, then you can think about things like, maybe I should pick this for someone who can benefit from it the most, which may not be the person who can do the best job. It depends what your goals are with the internships. But certainly early on, when you're learning, I would definitely recommend going for the easier options. Okay, I have talked a whole lot and I do have tips to share later, but for now, I wanted to ask if anyone had specific questions. And I'm going to offer, there's a few options. You could type them in the Etherpad here, line 76, or just pop them right in the chat. Either is fine. Actually, Etherpad is better because then we can have them recorded for later more easily. Okay, I'm going to not have the etherpad on the screen because I know how nervous it can be to be typing live on the screen in front of everyone, but I've opened it in another window so that I can still see what's going on. And we've got some great questions coming in. So the first question I have here is, do you always rely on being an organization to be a mentor? As a researcher, do I have to involve my university or can I apply as an individual? So there's a couple of things that you can do here. One thing is there's what's called umbrella organizations. This really only applies to Google Summer of Code, but umbrella organizations are organizations that allow multiple people from different projects to sort of participate as a group. So the Open Bioinformatics Foundation, for example, runs an umbrella organization for Google Summer of Code interns. And the idea is that someone else does the administration of the applications to Google Summer of Code, that any money that's exchanged doesn't have to worry the individual researchers who are participating. When I participated through an umbrella organization, I don't think we spoke to the university at all. Then the next year, my organization, when I worked at a university, we did decide to have our own organization all on our own, mostly because we wanted a bit more control over who got projects, which when you're part of an umbrella organization is a bit harder because someone else is administering it. And we did run it by our department at the time, just to see how they felt about it. At that particular time, the university, if I recall correctly, said, don't mention the university, just mention the open source project, and that was okay. It's probably a good idea to run it by your university if you're thinking of doing it that way, but also working through umbrella organizations can be a realistic and sometimes easier way to work. As an individual, you could apply, but I would just go back to the question of, are there at least 2 people working on this who... what's the word I'm looking for here? Who are in your community, so the intern isn't alone. So I wouldn't ever apply like as the University of Cambridge. I would apply more likely as a research group in the University of Cambridge if I was going to speak to, if I was going to apply on behalf of my organization. Okay, I'm going to move to the next question. Do you recommend the administrator, a clearly defined role in Google Summer of Code, be separate from the mentors, or is someone doing both roles realistic? Conflict of interest if you have to pick the student's project is one concern, but also being overloaded. So that's a really good question. So administering the organization can take a lot of work because you're going to be the person who's worrying about who gets which slots, who gets assigned to mentors and to the interns. When evaluations are due, so both Google Summer of Code and Outreach, you have evaluation periods where you have to say, has the student been doing what they're supposed to be doing? Is this code okay? And obviously, it's really good to have someone coordinating and making sure that everyone submits on time, because in my experience, a lot of people do need a gentle poke to say, hello, I know you've got a million emails, but can you please make sure that you answer this one before our poor intern fails, just because it wasn't answered. And that does take time, but actually I think that it almost hands over and transitions. So I sort of mentioned that there's the heaviest period at the start where all of the interns are saying, hi, accept my contribution. And then at that point as an admin, you don't have a lot to do. And then once actually there's the student selection, that becomes heavy for an admin, not so heavy for a mentor. And then once the interns are actually working, at that point, again, there's not that much for an admin to do. I mean, you can sort of choose to be more or less hands-on, but basically it tends to trade off that when you're mentoring, there isn't a lot of heavy admin duties, and when you're adminning heavily, there's not a lot of heavy mentor duties. So I don't think it's a massive conflict of interest in terms of time. It is more, like, I won't deny that, but I don't think it's like you're suddenly getting really huge amounts of work that you wouldn't otherwise. The comment about selecting your own projects or not, that's definitely a huge challenge. I don't have any good answers for that one, except that you'd better strive to be fair anyway, ideally. But I think there's a second part of this question as well. No, I think that probably answers that. If there's any more to that question, do let me know. Okay. Next question. Have you any guidance/advice for modulating the time you'd take for a project to the intern? Oh, to the time an intern might take for a project. Yeah, that is a nice one. So actually, in both of these internship program, I'm trying to think, my words are not coming today, and it's very irritating. I know exactly the word I want, and it just won't quite come out of the mouth. So part of the application process, interns write a proposal. And so at that point, they should write a program plan. They will, I would encourage it to be at a weekly basis and say, week 1, here's what I'm going to do. Week 2, here's what I'm going to do, and so on. And they will know how long it's going to last, whether it's Google Summer of Code, whether it's a short or long project, or whether it's outreachy. They know what the time period is going to be. And they should talk to you about that before they finalize their application. I would always, I can't remember the name of the law, which says that when you estimate the amount of time it'll take to do something, it'll always take longer, even if you take that rule into account. But I would always expect that any good, successful proposal should have a week or 2 that says, here's a week that's free where I'm going to do extra tasks, and here's the extra tasks that I'll do if I have time. And if I don't, then this is extra debugging time for in case we run late. I would not expect someone to work as fast as me. Because I've made a bunch of errors and learned the very, very hard way enough times that they probably haven't if they're inexperienced. And that's just the nature of this. So it's important to go into this thinking of it as, I'm helping someone learn to do this, but they're not just my employee. This is a nurturing relationship that goes both ways, and you're giving to them, not just worrying about the amount of time it takes and whether it's the fastest it can be. But yeah, the main thing, I would always absolutely thoroughly make sure that there is time for slippage. That should be planned. And if it's not, then you need to rescope. I would honestly think this is going to take me 8 weeks, then it's a 12-week project. That's how I would size these kinds of projects when I'm defining a project for the project list. I hope that answers that question. Righty, and now the question on line 81. Do you have some recommendation when to favour outreachy over Google Summer of Code for your own projects? Hofstadter's Law. Thank you, Bastian. I knew that there was a name. Okay, favouring outreachy versus Google Summer of Code. So I'm just thinking I'm saying this live on a recorded video, but Google's rich. Google's money comes from advertising and from watching people. If Google can pay for it, I would let Google pay for it. If it is a project that fits into Google Summer of Code, I would put it into Google Summer of Code. Or I would say both Google Summer of Code and Outreach are welcome to apply, because this time of year right now, people can apply for both. And it does happen sometimes that there are conflicts where someone gets into both Google Summer of Code and Outreachy. And you have to negotiate a little bit to figure out what's going on and who's going to be selected in the end. Outreachy has a broader remit than Google Summer of Code. So I would say anything that doesn't fit into Google Summer of Code, obviously go to Outreachy first. So that's anything that's open science but not code. That could be a design project. It could be UX, documentation. Those are all things that kind of have to go to Outreachy, simply because Google Summer of Code doesn't accept those, because Google's line for this is flip bits, not burgers. It must be code. It's in the name. Yeah, I think that's my rule of thumb. If it can be Google, make it Google. Otherwise, try and make it Outreachy. I've been talking a whole bunch. Anyone have any more questions? If not, I can continue. I've got a few more tips that I wanted to share. I'll just mute for a moment and see if any more questions come in. Okay, thank you to whatever hero is taking notes on the document. You are an amazing person, and I appreciate your work. So before I move on to the tips section, I actually had a couple other notes to mention. So Google Summer of Code organization applications closed yesterday, which was unfortunate timing. I'm very sorry. What I will say is if you know anyone who's running an umbrella organization, you can still speak to them and probably get your project ideas added to the list. So if you think, you know, I could get someone to work on my API or whatever the project may be, refactoring my project, then speak to an umbrella organization and just say, hey, I know that I can't apply as myself, but can I participate in your organization? And yes, thank you, Bastian. The Open Bioinformatics Foundation has such an umbrella organization. There's a fantastic ex-outreachy intern who was actually running that this year for the OBF. Bastian, maybe you could find a link and just pop that in the chat if anyone wants to speak to the OBF, just to see if you're interested in adding a project in there. Please go ahead. For Outreachy, the applications to be a mentoring organization are open for, I think, 3 days more. I think it's the 25th is the last day when you can apply to participate as an organization. So if you have ideas, now's a very good time to act on them, either whether it's Google Summer of Code or whether it is Outreachy. So let me check any more notes. No, nothing, no other questions. So I'm going to move on to my next screen, the tip screen. Let's see what I've got. Right, have a guide for applicants, participants, and mentors. So I have linked here on this slide. This is a guide that we wrote when I was working at a previous job, but it is very useful. So it has guidance for people who are applying for the internships, things like a template. One of the most common questions I got when people were writing their project proposal was, do you have a template? So we made one, not because we really needed a template, because it helped other people figure out how to structure their projects. It has things like tips for students who are applying, and it has advice for people once they've been accepted. So now that you've been accepted, meet with your mentor weekly. You know, here's how to interact with them. And we have advice and guidance for mentors as well. So this is things like what happens when there are payments, because, for example, Google pays people who mentor the interns. So you have to talk about how that money gets handled so that mentors are aware about transparently what's going on. So just make sure that you sort of have some of this available for other people. And the guide that I've put there, the Intermine Internships Guide, that is open source. You can fork it and modify it to your needs. I would definitely recommend, if you do that, make sure that you search and replace Intermine with your organization and then look for all the weird bits, because it talks about model organisms and about APIs. And if you don't have model organisms or APIs in your projects, then that's going to sound a bit odd. But most of that you can reuse very easily. And some of the parts that I would recommend from within that, have a grading rubric. So I think I mentioned a couple of times that actually one of the hardest things that I ever have to do when I'm running an internship round is decide which of these lovely humans we actually keep and we work with for the next few weeks. And I remember the very first time I was sitting here and I'm looking, okay, applicant A, they're really good. Applicant B, they're really good too. What do I do? And then I actually plugged it into a rubric that the organization administrator that we were participating with had recommended. And suddenly the decision became so much easier. So the guide that I mentioned earlier, the Intermine guide up here, this actually has links to a possible grading rubric you could use. You don't have to use this one, but it's one that gives you a start, and then you can change it in ways that work. But it gives you a structured way of thinking through what attributes do I value in my interns, and will they actually meet my needs? So this might be things that do they have experience? Have they ever written this language before? How is their project management? Or how is their community interaction? There are lots of things you could choose. But the main thing is that if you actually rate someone, then you get an idea about whether or not someone is going to be able to do the things that you value the most or not. Especially also, I would mention it's good if you have a lot of different mentors and you want things to look a bit more fair. Get 2 or 3 mentors to grade every intern. And that sort of helps normalize the scores amongst the different interns so that people don't feel like someone's being unfairly rated or someone's unfairly getting an intern when someone else didn't. I would also say keep your interns engaged by running community building activities. So one thing that I've done for the last few years was born out of an embarrassing mistake. It's one of the very early years that I had an intern right at the end. I ran a survey because I just wanted to ask how everyone had felt. And, you know, I think I had like 15-minute offboarding calls with all of our interns. And one of them said, Yo, I know this is weird to ask after my internship, but what exactly does your organization do? And I'm like, yeah, I have failed you if you've worked for me for 3 months and you're still not quite sure what the purpose of using this is. Like, they'd created an amazing app, but they'd done such a niche bit of work that they didn't understand what all the rest of it, all the parts that they didn't interact with were. And so I'd failed at my community building goal, really, because I'm trying to bring in contributors. And if he still doesn't know what it's going to do, he's not going to engage for a long term. So I changed things around. And the next year I started running calls where the first thing we'd do once people have started is we'd get everyone to introduce themselves to each other, talk about what project they were working on, and just talk about a few things like what does good code look like, just to get them thinking critically and get them a chance to talk with one another and to learn about the project. And so I think I built in 90-minute calls 3 times over the internship period. And it makes it nicer because they remember what the organization is. They get to not feel like they're alone at the end of the computer. And we get to meet them and interact with them and see what awesome people they are. So once again, you can get some templates. So the Intermine repository there has some links to templates so that you can actually already run the call. Basically, just copy and paste. And it has guidance on things like maybe doing a call where people talk about code quality review and offering feedback on code quality, what good team working is like and what bad team working is like. And these are just kind of things that are helping the interns think critically about interacting with others and interacting with the code that you're working on. I note, Peter, you said +1 on grading rubrics, not just assessing undergraduate coursework, but filtering applicants for internships and fellowships. And if you can share the rubric openly in advance, it helps applicants make their case clearer and relevant. Yeah, I fully agree with that. If you're inclined to fork the rubric that's on the Intermine internships repo, that is open so that other people can sort of think, okay, these are the things they're assessing against, so this is how I'm going to present myself. So that can help a lot. Right, next one, community building. We've got to be conscious about this. So it is possible to participate in Google Summer of Code or to participate in Outreachy, and you work with someone for 3 months and it was a job, and then they move on to the next job, and that was nice. And that's okay. I mean, that happens. It is reasonably common for that to happen. But the best way to keep people involved in your community and to keep them engaging with you is to ask them. And very often people will be delighted and really, really flattered. So if you have been in mentoring someone and you look at them and you think, hey, you know what, you're actually really good. Like maybe you have a Slack channel or an IRC channel or something like that, and they're helping out other people. That's mentor material. And you say to them, hey, do you want to come back next year? And this time you'll be a mentor and we'll help you with that. So don't worry, you know, because one of the things I see is people are very nervous the first time they mentor, which is understandable because they've never done it officially, even if you have noticed that actually they're incredible at it. But they don't come unless you ask them. And it takes 30 seconds to ask, but usually makes people feel really, really, really incredible and excited. Make sure that they get some onboarding as well, that they know what expectations they have now that they're a mentor, not an intern. And remind them that they actually know better than a lot of mentors because they've just been a student or an intern, and they know what it feels like when you don't know what to do and you're like, oh, should I bother my mentor or not? What if I think I'm stupid? And actually that makes them a really good mentor because they know exactly what this poor intern is going to be worrying about because they've just been in exactly the same shoes. So yeah, invite them back. And it is something beautiful when you see someone that you mentored one year mentoring someone the next year, and watching that chain or like dominoes just keep on falling and wondering how far the network can go, and knowing that early on you were actually involved in that. It's like, I know nothing that leaves me feeling so proud and so happy and so excited. Let me see. Right, so I'm going to try and recap some of the things that I've been trying to say, but I don't know if I've always said these like as directly as I've intended. So one is consciously design the interactions with your community. So don't assume that they'll know what to do. So that's why I'm saying provide these guidance, provide the rubrics, and tell people, here's the next step that you can take. Here's how to contribute, here's how to become a mentor, etc. Because if you don't consciously design it, things may happen in ways that you don't intend. And I'd always rather guide it and see it grow in a way that I would like to see, rather than an accidental way, which might not be something that works as well. Consider what value you're giving others and how you can maximize it. And this goes both ways. So it's not just I'm getting work from my intern, and it's not just that I'm putting effort into this, but we're getting a value exchange from this. And if something isn't working from you, figure out how to change that balance, because it may be that there are ways that you can make this better, or that you can make this more enriching for the side where it's uneven. And try and build those pathways for people to increase their engagement, so that next step is always clear. So if you think someone's ready to be a mentor, you invite them to be a mentor. Maybe after they've been a mentor, you invite them to be an organization administrator who actually corrals the mentors and make sure the mentors are doing what they need to do. And figure out what those pathways are, so that people can take those next steps if they want to take them. Because it's always easier to take a step on a path that someone's laid out for you than it is to sort of guess where you're going. I'm going to pause for a moment and open up for any more questions. If you just want to put, oops, this has stopped updating. Anyway, on that same question area, which is line 85 right now. If anyone has any more questions, I'm going to take a sip if you want to just add any questions in there. If not, I will continue on with a few more notes. Okay, thank you for giving me a chance just to have a sip and calm my poor throat. I see we have a lovely salmon pink question here. What would you recommend for first-time participants on the mentoring side? Joining an umbrella or participating in the program independently? So I have two answers to this. If it's Google Summer of Code, I would go for the umbrella. And the reason for that is that there are umbrellas in Google Summer of Code, and it does take a lot of the admin weight off your back. So someone else makes sure that the organization is eligible for Google Summer of Code, and they they will chase you about times probably if needed, like things like evaluations and so on. It just means there's a little bit less work for you when this is something that's very new to you. With Outreachy, umbrella organizations don't really exist, but I think Outreachy perhaps does provide a lot of hands-on guidance as well. They've got a nice Zulip chat where you can talk with other mentors and get advice on things that you're doing. But you can also probably find, I would say, pseudo umbrella organizations, find other people who've done it as well and ask their advice, because they'll probably be very happy to share what they've been doing, even if they can't actually do any of the admin burden for you. I will pause a moment more, see if anyone else has any other final questions. Okie dokie. Right, if you want to ping me afterwards with any questions, I'm also very happy to answer. So I'm going to just go through a last few tip slides that I have. I'm going to just mention a couple of other things that work quite nicely. So this isn't actually an internship program. Hacktoberfest is a very short-term, month-long drive to incentivize collaboration in open source software. But it's much easier to just do a little bit and dip your toes if you wish. And the idea is if you're using GitHub, that you can actually mark an issue on GitHub, so a small task, mark it with the tag Hacktoberfest, and ask people to work just on that particular issue. If they make, I think it's either 4 or 5 pull requests, so that's they make 4 or 5 contributions, they get a free t-shirt. So they have an incentive to do this, and you sort of get the experience of working with people in some small way, managing contributions, and what speeds it up and what makes it easier and what makes it slightly less easy. But I mean, the thing is, you can always take Hacktoberfest off of the issues, so you can try it very gently if you wish to do so. And I've had people I've hired when I first met them through Hacktoberfest. I've had people who moved from Hacktoberfest contributor to GSOC contributor, and then to mentors and to organization administrators. So I've had people like really walk up the ladder from having been a Hacktoberfest contributor. And I've gotten some beautiful logos and things like that. So it's not just code, but all sorts of different contributions come through Hacktoberfest. This is a bit janky again. So what I'm recommending here is just really good pathways to make it easy for people to participate. So this is a screenshot of an issue on GitHub. And what I wanted to highlight, if you see, is the area saying, if you want to pick up this task, it says 1, look at the contributing guidelines, comment on the issues stating that you're intending to work on this, and then make a pull request. And then also there's a section that says what you need to do if you need help. And this is really, really detailed. This is absolutely a case where I'm putting more time in. Like, I might be asking for someone to change the font color from blue to orange, and I've put in a lot of info just to say, here's what you need to do if you're doing help. And the reason that I'm doing this is because I want someone to learn about contributing. It's not about actually getting the work done. And so this is one thing that you can do. So basically everything from the, if you want to pick up this task downwards, is a template. I just copy and paste in every time. I don't write it. It just sort of saves me a bit of time. And people engage very nicely. So like I mentioned with Hacktoberfest, where I've had people who've contributed a little bit and they've actually then become long-term contributors. This kind of thing can help people grow, but it does mean that you have to be willing to put the time in up front, recognizing that actually it's a long-term commitment and you're planting a seed here and they're not a flower yet. And once again, you can see most of that screen. I'm really sorry about the janky slides, folks. What I was trying to highlight here is a contribution guide. This is something that people can look at, and it's really step by step so they understand what's going on. There's advice. There's things like, don't forget to be nice, to wait for us. If you take an issue and then you don't work on it in a few days, we may pass it on to someone else. If there's documentation missing, please write the documentation. And these are things that we've always written because we've actually had experience where people ask these questions. And it's a lot faster to put it down and then refer to the documents later than it is to ask the same question, to answer the same questions over and over and over. And it makes the pathways for people to contribute much easier. And this is especially valuable if you have interns coming in, because you can just say, please read this documentation. I mean, don't say it over and over if people are obviously not understanding the documentation. Because I think there's nothing more infuriating than being told to go and look at the docs if I already have looked at the docs. But at least you have something that you can refer to when people need these questions. And you won't even see all the people who don't come to you with questions once you have the documentation really clearly done. We're at time. I am just about running my voice off. I will just, once again, if there's any more final questions that anyone wants to share, you have a moment now. If not, let's wrap up. Okay, I'm going to sign off with one final thing. If you get to the end of this period and you've had some interns and they've been doing some cool work, and we know they've been doing cool work at this point, give them the chance to be really proud of themselves. Maybe present what they've been doing to your community, a 5-minute video. And yeah, that's it. I'm going to sign off. Have a beautiful day, y'all, and I will make sure that the documentation for this is uploaded and saved.